Hi everyone, it's William Lee, back with another episode of Life on the Magic Mountain, my series comparing Thomas Mann's famous novel, The Magic Mountain, with the reality of life in Davos at a tuberculosis sanatorium before the First World War. So, and the specific, even though Thomas Mann and his wife Katya stayed at a place called Wald Sanatorium, my specific frame of reference is Sanatorium Schatzalp. And so this is actually part two. Maybe you've seen a really short, between 3 or 4 minutes. I hope you've seen it. The original installment that I did for this episode, I did at Schatzalp, and it turned out to be problematic because of sound, mainly. There was activity going on and there was music going on at that particular time, and so I decided, well, I also can improve the content a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and redo that. I'm not at Schatzalp at the moment. I'm at my home in the U.S., and so I decided to edit that, and I wanted you to be able to see the room in the background at Schatzalp, so I'm posting those first few minutes, or have already. And I was filming there in a more public part of the hotel, which is why at that particular instance there was the music. And so it was what I call the Spielzimmer, so the game room, although there also is a designated Spielzimmer in the medical wing, which is a playroom for children. So this one, if you look at the video, you'll see the wallpaper just below the ceiling showing chess pieces, and I think some other game is represented. And unfortunately, what you don't see in that video is that that little room housed the English library, which is really lovely. It's in cabinets, and all the books are bound in the same red, and it's quite an extensive library and quite a good one. And so unfortunately you don't see that, but so it goes. When I get back to Schatzalp, I will be more judicious in choosing a good time to make a video in there. All right, so the subchapter that we're dealing with today, as I mentioned in the original video, is one called Breakfast in the Magic Mountain. And it's a long and very interesting chapter, despite the fact that the name itself isn't particularly important sounding. But most of it takes place on Hans Castorp's first full day at the sanatorium. He wakes up and his cousin takes him down to breakfast in the dining room. And so this is what is referred to as first breakfast, and it's quite an informal affair, and not all of the ambulatory residents of the sanatorium are participating in it. And the schedule I have for a patient who was at Schatzalp in 1910, 1914, does not show breakfast. First breakfast, second breakfast. Does it show first breakfast? Does it show breakfast? Probably. Yeah, it shows the meals. It shows breakfast, but it doesn't show two breakfasts. So apparently that wasn't the tradition at Schatzalp. And with Grand Duke Dmitri too, he never once mentions breakfast while he's at Schatzalp. He apparently, his custom at other times in his life, when he wasn't at the sanatorium, was to have breakfast in his room, a very simple breakfast in his room, something like coffee and bread, a sort of continental breakfast. The exception being when he was at a house party in England, and then there would be a big breakfast buffet, and then he would do that. And so this is also the case at Schatzalp. There's a brilliant breakfast buffet that's included in the price of the room, and it's great. I've never seen another one. I mean, honestly, I've never seen one better in a hotel. So Thomas Mann describes the food that is available to the patients at that first breakfast as marmalade, honey, oatmeal, creamed rice, scrambled eggs, cold meats, cheese, fruit, fresh and dried, all on the table. So you have that and other things as well at the Shots Out breakfast buffet. The difference being that they're not all on the individual tables. We're not sitting at big communal tables anymore at Shots Out, which was the case at the sanatorium, as Thomas Mann describes it, and possibly was also the case at Shots Out. I don't know. Unfortunately, Dimitri doesn't provide that detail, although he was eating meals downstairs. Okay, so at Shots Out, they're on a sideboard, they're a buffet, and in the Magic Mountain, the food is right there on the table. Okay, so that's not particularly important. So let us go on. So in doing a sort of analysis of this chapter, I decided that what Hans Castorp is learning on this first day, and what he's learned a little bit about the day before, is what kind of people he's going to encounter in a tuberculosis sanatorium in Davos. In his case, it was 1907. And I made an error in the first episode when I said that he'd gotten there at the end of August 1907, and he actually had gotten there at the end of July 1907. So I have today an authentic published guest list from Shots Out from the 27th of July 1907. So we'll look at that in a few minutes. But in the meantime, these sort of four, let's see, do I have it in 4 or 5? I have it in 5 categories of people whom Hans Castorp has either met or heard about by the middle of his first day at Shots Out. At Valda Sanatorium. So the first category, well, he's found out that not everyone at a TB sanatorium is civilized, not even an inexpensive TB sanatorium. And Hans Castorp is what you would call hyper-civilized in a sort of class sense. The rules of how a well-bred person behaves are extremely important to him, and he finds that not everyone at the Berghof, which is the fictional name of the sanatorium, is a civilized person. And it starts out for him by hearing the people in the room next door to his having sex, which disturbs him. All right, so that's the first category. The second category is people who are genuinely ill and dying, not sort of ambulatory people who look fine, like his cousin Joachim. Joachim is actually quite sick, but Castorp's first impression on seeing him is that, wow, you're so much better than the last time I see you. You look really healthy and sporty and all that kind of thing. But he finds out initially from hearing a man behind a closed door coughing, and then from a man named Blumenkohl who comes to the table where Hans Castorp is sitting and is obviously very ill, even though he's allowed to have his meal downstairs, his breakfast downstairs. So that's a revelation to Hans Castorp. I'm sure it's not a revelation to you. All right, category 3. There are married couples and families in sanatoriums. So he wasn't expecting that. So obviously the couple in the room next to his who made all the ruckus that morning were a married couple. And there's also a whole family that he meets. Well, he doesn't meet them. He's not introduced to them, but they're at another table in breakfast, a whole Russian family with a husband and wife and with children, multiple children. And he also discovers that within these families, not everybody is ill. So, for instance, the couple that offended him in the morning, one of them is ill and one of them is not. It seems like with the Russian family, it seems like most of the children are getting treatment, whether they had TB or not. They're sort of thin, unhealthy looking children, and the mother as well. I'm not sure about the father, but this was a practice that you saw, and we'll see that on the Shots Out guest list, in sanatoriums at this time, that you would have whole families come, or you would have a parent bringing children with him or her. And since they weren't actually treating children, at least not small children at Shots Out, teenagers, I'm sure obviously they did teenagers, but small children, no. There were specialized sanatoriums for small children with tuberculosis, because childhood tuberculosis very often is a completely different disease from adult tuberculosis, affecting other parts of the bodies rather than lung. The biggest would be bone tuberculosis in children, and even when it was pulmonary, it tended to present itself differently from the adult form of tuberculosis. And just like with cancer, childhood cancers are treated and are viewed as very distinct diseases from adult cancers in most form, even if they affect the same part of the body. So this was a practice that eventually died out, I think probably after the First World War. So at this time, in 1907, they already knew that TB was an infectious disease and that it was caused by a bacterium, but they didn't seem to think too much about that, because, people would bring their kids with them. I have a photo of New Year's Eve party at Shots Out where there are 3 little kids who were, or 4 actually, who were almost certainly completely healthy. Of course, TB did, so the idea that it was hereditary, that it ran in families, is of course not true. But if you were in a family where one parent or one grandparent or one member of the family had an active infectious case of tuberculosis, then yes, it's not going to be at all surprising that other members of the family end up getting it as well. And there was some, with any disease, it seems like they're finding out more and more that certain genetic makeups do, give you more or less resistance to a disease. And so certainly in other reading I've done on tuberculosis sanatoriums, diaries and memoirs of patients, they would meet people whose families had just been wiped out by the disease. Someone would come who had lost both parents to the disease and been raised by other relatives, and then he or she with his or her siblings had ended up having it as well. So I shouldn't say, because I'm not qualified to say if there's sort of instances where the genetic resistance is less. But at any rate, that was a phenomenon in any sanatorium, public or private, that you would find people whose families were just devastatingly affected by this disease. But anyway, after the First World War, people are not bringing children to tuberculosis sanatoriums anymore. If the children have tuberculosis, they go to a children's sanatorium. But married couples do persist. So at the time that Dimitri was at Shots Out in 1939 through 1942, there was at least one married couple. I think it was only one at Shots Out, a German couple who had immigrated to Ireland, and then the husband was the one who was ill and had tuberculosis, and the wife stayed with him there the whole time. Okay, so that was category level 3. Category number 4 is foreigners, as our friend Joachim puts it. That's something that he's kind of fixated on, dividing people into Germans and foreigners, even though he himself is a foreigner in Switzerland, you could say. So the fact that the sanatoria in Davos were so international meant that you had multiple languages and multiple nationality. So the fifth characteristic would be, so I had divided it in the fourth being language and culture, and the fifth being nationalities in a political sense. So, but if we put both of those together, we have the issue of language being potentially a very, very isolating thing. If you went to a sanatorium and you were the only person who spoke your particular language, then yes, this is going to be, it's going to really add to your sense of isolation. I mean, isolation was a thing that people had a problem with anyway. You know, Dmitri spoke French and English in addition to Russian, and he had some German, so language wasn't an issue in his case. But he felt isolated even without that, because he didn't have a spouse with him. He didn't have any family member or any close friend with him. He, he got to make friends at the sanatorium, a few, but he was outside, completely removed from what had been his community and his circle of friends and relatives before he came to the sanatorium. So I would think that would have been a big issue for a lot of patients. And in fact, at one point, which we'll get to, Hans Castorp starts visiting bedridden patients, and he finds that they're often just desperate for visitors, and they'll start to cry just at the idea that someone other than the staff have come to visit them. All right, so nationalities could be an issue during particular fraught political times, but I've never heard of, there's a fight that breaks out in the Magic Mountain, but there's no intimations whatsoever in Dimitri's diaries that that it was an issue at Schatzalp, although there was this one German couple that had immigrated to Ireland. They were ardent Nazis in a sanatorium that was specifically and overtly anti-Nazi. So why they decided to go there, I don't know, but I bet they had to watch their P's and Q's. Anyway, so here we have Joachim instructing his cousin about these two issues of language and nationality. And he tells his cousin about a patient who can be seen every morning, and Hans Castorp does indeed see her, walking out front of the sanatorium in the garden, an older woman dressed all in black, a widow, and she comes from Mexico. And both of her sons are ill with tuberculosis and are basically dying and bedridden in the sanatorium. And Joachim explains that she doesn't speak anything but Mexican Spanish and a little bit of French. I mean, one or two phrases. And one of the phrases she knows is tous les deux. So both of them. And so if anybody is introduced to her, because of the language barrier, the only thing she can do is sort of nod her head and say tous les deux. And Hans Castorp is quite intrigued by that. And so he gives Joachim explicit permission to introduce him to her. He doesn't want to be introduced to his next door neighbors, the married couple, but he does want to be introduced to tous les deux. Okay, and so the staff were, I think you weren't going to get a job as staff in one of the roles at the sanatorium, like a nurse or a doctor or a business manager or somebody like that who's going to be working with the public. You weren't going to get such a job unless you spoke sort of the basic languages, which would be German, French, and English. And maybe you wouldn't be fluent in all three, but you certainly would be able to communicate with people at some level. Okay. And that remains the case certainly at Schatzalp, and I assume at the other hotels in Davos. They remain very, very international. I was just talking to Paolo Bernardo, the manager at Schatzalp, about that very issue, and about putting together some material on how international Schatzalp has always been, and the number of nationalities, both in the sanatorium era and it was a hotel, when it was a hotel. Okay, anyway, so Joachim tells Hans, it's not at all easy to make acquaintances here, if only because there are so many foreigners among the guests. So he's not even talking about languages. He has this tendency, he's a soldier, he's an officer, and he's desperate to return to his career as a German officer. And I'm not saying that all officers were this way, God forbid, but in his case, he sort of divides the world into us and them, into Germans and foreigners. And for him, the barrier with getting to know people, or with making an effort to get to know people, is that they're foreigners. And in fact, he's got a really strong crush on a young Russian woman. And his cousin notices it right away. It's very clear. But he does everything he can to disguise it and to rid himself of that. He won't even look at her, let alone speak to her. And he's a single young man, but I mean, probably both because he wanted to be focused on his career, and he didn't want to have anything, including a sanatorium romance, that would prolong his time at the Berghof, and the other reason being she's a foreigner. So that's his hang-up. Hans Castorp has another hang-up, and his hang-up is that, unfortunately, our hero in the novel is a thoroughgoing snob. Everything for him is about how well-bred a person is in the sense of their behavior. And he's much more open to new people than Joachim is. So he doesn't let that stand in his way. And I should add the fact that Joachim is never rude to anyone. He is always very formal, but very courteous and even kind to people. He starts visiting patients too. He comes along with Hans Castorp, and I think he grows a little as a person as the book progresses. Hans Castorp is a snob from beginning to end, and he has this disconcerting habit of forming sort of images of people when he first meets them and putting them in categories. So there's a woman at his table whom he automatically thinks of as the seamstress, and she's not a seamstress. I mean, seamstresses would not, alas, have been at the Berghof or at Schatzalp, because these were quite exclusive, well, financially exclusive sanatoriums. They cost a lot of money. So that was the dividing line. And when he meets the man who becomes his mentor and surrogate father, Settembrini, he immediately thinks of that man as being an organ grinder. And so this is his habit, but he doesn't let it stand in the way of getting to know people. So good for him, cut him some slack in that respect. He's curious about everybody, and aside from the married couple who have offended him so much, he's not resisting getting to know anyone. He's not saying, oh, don't introduce me to that person. And in fact, he has a romance with a Russian woman that he does not hold back the way Joachim does. Okay, so I think that's all. I'm not so sure that's correct. In fact, I get the impression that it's not correct, that what Joachim says about the nationalities not mixing, because, well, I mean, when Dmitri was there beginning in 1939, he was the only Russian. So if that had been true, he never would have, spoke to anyone, which he certainly did. But then he was raised as a member of the Russian royal family to have a cosmopolitan sort of cosmopolitan international outlook on life. He traveled from the time he was young, and he didn't. I mean, royalty in Europe at that time was basically just one big German family spread out over all the countries of Europe. And so when they got together, they spoke French, English, and German. In Dimitri's case, that part of the family, it was mostly English. He grew up speaking English and was taking German classes and French classes. But anyway, I am digressing. So let's look at the, if I can show it to you. This isn't going to be easy. This is on my computer screen. You can see, well, you can't read it, but at least you can see what it looks like. So on this guest list, for the 27th of July, 1907, we have 69 guests. I call them guests because not all of them would have been patients. Some were visitors, like Hans Castorp himself. So this really accords to a T with what Thomas Mann's description is of there being room for 70 people, table space for 70 people in the dining room at the Berghof. So here we have 69 people on the Shots Out guest list. Not all of them would have been allowed to come downstairs for meals, which was very much a privilege. But anyway, let's see. So Joachim talks about, at one point, the funny names that you encounter, meaning the non-German names. So here's a sampling from this list. We have Madame Estefania de Lacerda. She is from Lisbon. And Alfredo Lazareschi Pistoia is the name. He's of the town. He's Italian. And who else do we have? We had a Mademoiselle Dimitriou from Athens, and a Miss Kennington from England. So all of these would have struck Joachim as being funny names and foreigners. And as far as the nationalities, this was actually exceptionally small number of different nationalities at Schatz Alp at that time. Or I'm sorry, looking at the Schatz Alp guest list, because sometimes there are 28, 29, 30, 31. I think I've even encountered 32 at a given time. But in this instance, we have 16. So pretty small. I mean, very international, but pretty small for Schatz Alp specifically. And so what we have in the breakdown is 15 people from Germany, 13 from Portugal, 7 from France, 5 from Russia, 5 from Romania, 3 from Austria, 3 from Italy, 3 from Greece, 3 from England, 3 from the United States, 2 from Hungary, and then we have 1 each from Poland, Bulgaria, Spain, Belgium, and Switzerland. Excuse me. So if you were from any of those countries, well, I mean, if you were from, if you were from Belgium, you were going to speak French, and if you were from Switzerland, you were going to speak German, French, or Italian. But if you were from Poland or Bulgaria, or the person from Spain, you might not have somebody there who spoke your language. Although the chances are that if you were from a background where you could be at Schatz Alp and you would go to an international sanatorium, the chances are that you were a person who spoke more than one language. So as far as Tous les Deux coming from Mexico, there are guests on the guest list over the years. I've done up to 1915, and I have found guests from Mexico or patients from Mexico. Although people from Mexico were a rarity compared to other parts of the New World, and specifically South America. There were so many people from South America. That was a surprising thing that I discovered. There were people from Argentina, Venezuela, Brazil. I mean, not just a few people. People from Cuba, Uruguay, Colombia, you name it. There were people from those places. Okay. I wonder what kind, actually, I do wonder what kind of advertising, that, if any, they were doing in South America, because people made their way there. And you see this phenomenon that was very consistent at Schatzalp of there being a lot of people from Portugal. So we have 13 Portuguese at Schatzalp, second only to the number of Germans. I mean, barely second. There were 15 from Germany. So, and this includes one big Portuguese family with 6 members who were all there at the same time. There was what looks to have been a mother and father and 2 daughters, or 1 daughter, and then 3 girls, 3 mademoiselles who have a different surname but are clearly part of this family, because while this family is here, they're here, and when this family goes, they go. So it's all one big group. And what else can I say about this guest list? Well, I mean, another thing that would have brought people together or possibly divided them would be their profession. And sometimes the person who fills out the registration includes their profession, and I always love that. There were a lot of medical doctors. There were, a lot of professional people, a lot of members of the nobility, and sometimes royalty, and yeah, a lot of architects for some reason. A lot of architects and medical doctors, which almost makes me wonder if they were sort of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Oh, I have tuberculosis, I'll go someplace that's interesting for an architect, or I'll go someplace where I can, I can learn something from the medical staff. And I know for a fact that happened. I know of at least one medical doctor, who was an sort of apprentice to the Schatzalp head doctor, and at the same time he was a patient. But I am rambling, so I'm going to stop there, and thank you so much for listening. And I've been posting these once a week, so hopefully next week I will be able to post one that was actually recorded at Schatzalp. All right, bye.